the 17th of January 1943. 32,000 feet above the frozen earth of northern Germany. The air is thin enough to crack skin, cold enough to freeze blood in exposed veins. Inside the belly of a B-17 flying fortress, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski presses his gloved hand against the aluminum fuselage and feels it tremble not from fear, but from the violence of 4 Wright Cyclone engines dragging 27 tons of steel, bombs, and American resolve through a sky that does not want them there. Through the waist-gun window, he watches the formation, 37 bombers stretched across the winter sky like a geometric promise, their silver bodies catching the pale morning light. Below, somewhere in that white silence, German officers are receiving reports. Reports that will, in the coming minutes, force them to recalculate everything they believed about warfare, about will, about the kind of enemy they are facing. The flak begins at 0947 hours. Black flowers bloom in the sky, 88mm shells detonating in choreographed fury, each explosion a thunder that arrives without warning, each burst sending shrapnel the size of a man's fist through the air at speeds that tear aluminum like paper. The German anti-aircraft batteries below are firing in calculated patterns, creating boxes of death that bombers must fly through, cannot avoid, can only endure. Kowalski watches the flak burst near the lead bomber, close enough that the concussion rocks his own aircraft, close enough to see the orange heart of each explosion before the black smoke swallows it. This is what the Luftwaffe command promised their men would stop the Americans, a wall of steel and fire so dense that nothing could pass through it intact. But the Americans do not turn. The formation holds. Through the flak, through the violence, through the mathematical certainty that some of them will not survive the next 60 seconds they hold. To the German officers watching from observation posts below, tracking the bombers through binoculars and plotting tables, this is the moment that cracks something in their understanding. They have faced the RAF night bombers, watched them scatter when intercepted, seen them drop their loads early and flee for home. They have built an entire doctrine around the assumption that strategic bombing requires cover of darkness, requires evasion, requires anything except this. Broad daylight, high altitude, straight and level, flying directly into concentrated fire. The Americans are doing exactly that. To understand what the German commanders were witnessing, one must step back 18 months to the summer of 1941, when the United States Army Air Corps was little more than a promising idea and a fleet of aircraft that had never faced combat. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing was born not from battlefield experience, but from peacetime theory. The belief that heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formation at high altitude, could defend themselves with massed machine gun fire while delivering bombs with unprecedented accuracy on specific industrial and military targets. It was an American idea, ambitious and untested, rooted in the democratic optimism that technology and training could overcome the brutal arithmetic of war. The Germans had their own calculations. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had been fighting for nearly 4 years. They had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries. Their pilots were veterans with kill counts that read like fiction. Their anti-aircraft network was the most sophisticated in the world, thousands of 88mm guns linked by telephone and radar, capable of putting up a curtain of steel that could shred any formation. Their fighter tactics had been refined in the crucible of the Eastern Front and the skies over Britain. When American bombers began appearing over occupied Europe in late 1942, German officers assessed them with professional interest and arrived at a confident conclusion. The Americans would learn what the British had learned. Daylight bombing against a prepared defense was suicide. The doctrine would collapse within weeks. But on this January morning, as the 91st Bomb Group approaches the industrial complex at Wilhelmshaven, the test is still playing out. The German fighters come next, Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds, sleek and deadly, rising from airfields that dot the German countryside like a rash. They climb to altitude and begin their attacks, head-on passes at combined closing speeds of 600 miles per hour, their cannons and machine guns creating a cone of fire that the bombers must fly through. The Luftwaffe pilots are skilled, aggressive, fearless. They have been told that a single 20mm cannon shell in the right place can bring down a B-17. They have been told that the Americans are green, inexperienced, that their gunners will panic when faced with a fighter diving at them out of the sun. Some of this is true. Many of the American crews are on their first or second mission. Some of the gunners are 19 years old, farm boys from Iowa, and factory workers from Detroit who 6 months ago had never been in an airplane. But they have something the Germans did not account for. They have been trained as a crew, not as individuals. Every bomber carries 10 men who have learned to function as a single organism, pilot and co-pilot, navigator and bombardier, engineer and radio operator, 4 gunners covering every angle of approach, and they have firepower. 13 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, arranged to create overlapping fields of fire that turn the entire formation into a moving fortress of lead. When the German fighters press their attacks, they encounter something unexpected. The American gunners do not panic. They track the targets, lead the fast-moving fighters with their sights, fire in controlled bursts. The 50 caliber rounds, heavy, powerful, capable of punching through armor at 1,000 yards, begin finding their marks. A Fokker-Wulf takes hits in the engine, trails smoke, rolls away from the formation. A Messerschmitt's canopy shatters, and the aircraft tumbles into a spin. The defensive fire is not perfect, not even particularly accurate by training standards. But there is so much of it, so many tracers stitching through the sky, that the German pilots are forced to break off attacks earlier than planned, to approach with more caution, to respect the danger. From his position in the waist of the bomber, Kowalski fires until the barrel of his machine gun is hot enough to shimmer. He does not think about the men in the fighters, does not consider that they have mothers and girlfriends and favorite meals. He thinks about the rhythm target. Lead, burst, repeat. He thinks about the man across from him at the other waist gun, a kid from Tennessee who keeps yelling commentary that no one can hear over the engine noise and the gunfire. He thinks about staying alive for the next 30 seconds, then the 30 seconds after that. The German officers on the ground are receiving real-time reports from their fighter pilots over radio, and the reports are creating a problem. The Americans are not turning back, despite losses, and there are losses, bombers falling from formation with engines on fire, wings shot away, fuselages torn open. The formation is not breaking. The survivors are closing ranks, tightening their defensive box, continuing toward the target. This is not supposed to happen. Aircraft are expensive, crews take months to train, and rational military doctrine says that when losses exceed a certain threshold, you abort the mission, save what can be saved, try again another day under better conditions. The Americans appear to be operating under different rules. At 1,023 hours, the lead bombardier in the formation picks up the target in his Norden bomb sight, a precision instrument that cost more than most houses, capable of calculating drift, altitude, airspeed, and trajectory to deliver bombs within a few hundred feet of an aiming point from 6 miles up. The bomber bay doors open. The aircraft, which has been jinking and weaving slightly to avoid flak, steadies into its bomb run. For the next 90 seconds, while the Norden sight calculates and adjusts, the bomber must fly straight and level. No evasion, no defensive maneuvers. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability, the moment when a bomber crew offers itself to the enemy and trusts that their aircraft, their formation, their training will be enough. The flak intensifies. The German gunners on the ground know the bombers are committed now, know they cannot turn away. The sky becomes a wall of black explosions. Shrapnel tears through aluminum, through hydraulic lines, through flesh. In one bomber, a shell detonates inside the fuselage, killing the navigator instantly and wounding the bombardier. The aircraft drops out of formation, trailing debris. In another, a chunk of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate punches through the cockpit windscreen, missing the pilot by inches. The pilot does not flinch. He maintains heading, maintains altitude, flies the numbers the bombardier is calling out over the intercom. And then the bombs fall. 250-pound bombs and 500-pound bombs and 1,000-pounders, tumbling from the open bay doors in a stream that seems almost lazy, until you remember they are falling at terminal velocity toward targets that have been plotted on maps for weeks. The bombardier watches them fall, corrects for wind, releases the next stick. Across the formation, dozens of bombardiers are doing the same, each one linked to the lead aircraft, each one dropping on the leader's signal. The result is a concentration of high explosive that hits the Wilhelmshaven shipyards like a hammer strike, warehouses collapsing, cranes toppling, fires igniting in fuel storage tanks. The smoke rises in a pillar that will be visible for 50 miles. On the ground, German personnel scramble for shelters. Factory workers who minutes ago were assembling U-boat components are now running through smoke and rubble, ears ringing from concussion, lungs burning from dust and chemical fumes. The damage is significant but not crippling. The Germans will rebuild, will have the shipyards partially operational again within weeks. But that is not the point. The point is that the Americans came, dropped their bombs on the target they intended to hit, and did it in broad daylight against the full weight of German air defense. The bombers turn for home, and this is when the second shock arrives. The German fighter pilots, regrouping after the initial attacks, expect the American formation to disintegrate now that the bombs are gone and the mission is technically complete. Damaged bombers will straggle, fall behind, become easy targets for individual fighters to pick off. This is the pattern from every other air campaign. The return flight is when the real slaughter happens, when disciplined formations break down into a race for survival. The German pilots position themselves along the return route, engines throttled back to conserve fuel, waiting for the inevitable scattering. It does not come. The Americans maintain formation. The bombers that have taken damage fight to stay with the group, their pilots nursing wounded engines, their crews throwing out every piece of non-essential equipment to maintain altitude. The waist gunners toss out ammunition boxes, oxygen bottles, even their flak jackets, anything to reduce weight, to keep the aircraft in formation where the combined defensive fire can protect it. One bomber, with two engines out and the tail section shredded by cannon fire, stays with the formation for 40 minutes before finally falling behind. When it does, two other bombers drop out of formation to escort it, covering it with their guns until German fighters make the math unfavorable and they are forced to leave it. The crippled bomber ditches in the North Sea. The crew is never recovered, but the majority make it back. Of the 37 bombers that started the mission, 29 return to their bases in England. The loss rate, just over 20%, is high enough to be unsustainable by peacetime standards. But this is not peacetime. And more importantly, from the German perspective, it is not high enough. The Luftwaffe has thrown everything at these bombers, flak, fighters, the advantage of fighting over their own territory, and the Americans absorbed it, completed their mission, and brought most of their aircraft home. In the debriefing rooms at German Fighter Command, the reports create an uncomfortable silence. The pilots describe the American tactics, the tight formations, the volume of defensive fire. They describe bombers with engines on fire that stayed in formation, aircraft with holes large enough to climb through that continued flying. One pilot, an ace with 14 kills, describes putting a burst of cannon fire into a B-17's wing root, the kind of damage that should have torn the wing off, and watching the bomber hold together, hold formation, continue flying. His report uses a phrase that will appear in multiple debriefings over the coming months. Unnatural resilience. The Americans call it different things. Engineering, over-engineering, building an aircraft not to the minimum standards required, but to standards that include redundancy, backup systems, armor plate in places where armor adds weight but saves lives. The B-17 is not the fastest bomber or the most maneuverable, but it is, by a significant margin, the most survivable. Its wings are built to withstand battle damage that would down other aircraft. Its control surfaces have redundant cables. Its fuel tanks are self-sealing. It can fly with two engines out, can fly with half a tail, can fly with sections of wing missing. It is designed with the understanding that it will be shot at, will be hit, and must continue flying anyway. This is not accidental. It is a deliberate expression of American industrial philosophy, the idea that resources, when abundant, should be used to protect the men who fight, German aircraft design prioritizes performance: lighter, faster, more maneuverable. Every kilogram of weight is scrutinized, every system optimized for maximum efficiency. This makes sense in a resource-constrained economy where aluminum is precious and fuel is rationed. But American factories are producing aluminum in quantities the Germans cannot match, and American refineries are pumping out aviation fuel measured in millions of gallons. So, American engineers design for survival. They add weight. They add armor. They add redundancy. They create an aircraft that can take punishment and bring its crew home. To the German officers studying the battle reports, this represents something more troubling than just good engineering. It represents a mindset, an economy, a society that can afford to prioritize the survival of individual soldiers, even at the cost of efficiency. In the German military tradition, soldiers are expected to be hard, to endure, to sacrifice. Equipment is used until it breaks, then replaced. Casualties are factored into planning as a necessary cost. But the Americans seem to be operating under the assumption that every crew matters, that bringing men home is as important as destroying the target. This is difficult to reconcile with the propaganda that German soldiers have been fed about their enemies. The Americans are supposed to be soft, decadent, obsessed with comfort. They are supposed to lack the warrior spirit, the willingness to accept sacrifice that true soldiers possess. Yet here they are, flying through flak that kills randomly and absolutely, maintaining formation under conditions that would break lesser men, doing it day after day with a stubbornness that looks less like bravery and more like industrial process. Over the next 6 months, the dynamic plays out repeatedly. The Americans bomb Hamburg, Bremen, Emden, Kiel. They take losses, terrible losses, missions where a third of the bombers do not return, where entire crews are killed in seconds by direct flak hits or fighter attacks. But they keep coming. The bomber production lines in American factories are turning out aircraft faster than the Germans can shoot them down. Crew training programs are graduating new pilots and gunners faster than attrition can deplete the ranks. The mathematical exchange rate, which initially favored the defenders, begins to shift. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe is facing a crisis it did not anticipate. Fuel shortages limit training hours for new pilots. Aircraft production cannot keep pace with losses. The Eastern Front is consuming resources at a staggering rate, and every day American bombers are appearing over German cities, forcing the Luftwaffe to maintain fighter forces in the West that are desperately needed in the East. The strategic calculation that daylight bombing would be too costly for the Americans to sustain is proving false. The Americans can sustain it. They have the industrial capacity, the trained manpower, the logistical infrastructure to take losses that would cripple another nation and keep fighting. There is a moment in August 1943 that crystallizes this for many German officers. The Americans launch a mission against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, a target deep inside Germany, beyond the range of fighter escort, requiring bombers to fly hundreds of miles through enemy territory with no protection except their own guns. German intelligence picks up the raid early. Fighters from across southern Germany are scrambled. This is the kind of target the Luftwaffe has been waiting for. Isolated bombers, far from home, with no escorts. The perfect opportunity to inflict catastrophic losses, to break the back of the American daylight bombing campaign. The battle that follows is one of the most violent air engagements of the war. German fighters attack in waves, pressing their attacks with a ferocity born of desperation. They know this is their chance. They fly through the American defensive fire, taking losses, but inflicting worse. Bombers fall out of formation, wings folding, fuselages breaking apart, crews bailing out over German farmland. By the time the survivors reach Schweinfurt and drop their bombs, the formation is ragged, depleted. The return flight is a running battle that lasts 2 hours. Of the 230 bombers that started the mission, 60 do not return. Another 17 are damaged beyond repair. The losses are devastating. German radio announces a great victory. Luftwaffe pilots are decorated. The bomber crews who survived are interviewed, and their accounts describe scenes of apocalyptic violence, aircraft exploding, parachutes streaming, the sky full of smoke and debris. For a brief moment, it seems like the German calculations were correct, like daylight bombing truly is unsustainable. But 6 days later, the Americans come back. Not to Schweinfurt, the planners are not suicidal, but to other targets, flying the same tactics, the same formations, with the same grinding determination. The losses from Schweinfurt are replaced within weeks. New crews arrive from training bases in Texas and Arizona. New aircraft roll off assembly lines in Seattle and Long Beach. The campaign continues, and this is when the psychological impact on German commanders becomes acute. They have just inflicted the kind of losses that should have ended the daylight bombing campaign, that should have forced the Americans to rethink their entire strategy. Instead, the Americans absorbed the losses like a body absorbs a punch and kept fighting. This is not how war is supposed to work. In the German experience, in the European experience, nations have limits. You inflict enough casualties, destroy enough equipment, and eventually the enemy sues for peace or collapses. But the Americans seem to have access to reserves that are functionally bottomless. Every bomber shot down is replaced by 2 more. Every pilot killed is replaced by freshly trained crews, who have never seen combat but fly with the same robotic discipline as the veterans. It is not bravery. Exactly, bravery is individual, personal, can be broken. This is something industrial, mechanical, a process that continues regardless of losses, because the system that produces it is too large to be stopped by anything except total defeat. The symbolic weight of the bomber formations becomes, over time, more significant than the physical damage they inflict. Yes, the factories are damaged, the oil refineries are destroyed, the transportation networks are disrupted, but the deeper impact is psychological. Every day that American bombers appear over Germany is a day that the Luftwaffe has failed, a day that German air defenses have been proven inadequate, a day that ordinary German citizens can look up and see silver aircraft flying in geometrically perfect formations, untouchable, unafraid. The propaganda promise that the fatherland is secure, that German military superiority will protect the homeland, is being visibly disproven at 30,000 feet. German soldiers on leave from the Eastern Front, men who have been told they are fighting to save civilization from Bolshevism, come home to find their cities pockmarked with bomb craters, their families living in basements, the night sky filled with searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. They hear the air raid sirens, see the formations passing overhead in broad daylight, and they begin to ask questions. If Germany is winning, why are enemy bombers able to fly over Berlin? If the Luftwaffe is the best air force in the world, why can it not stop these attacks? The answers their officers give that the Americans have more resources, more aircraft, more men do not satisfy, because implicit in that answer is an uncomfortable truth. Germany is being outproduced, outmanned, outsustained by an enemy that was supposed to be weak. In the officers' clubs and command posts, where German officers speak freely, the tone changes over the course of 1,943 and 1,944. Early in the war, there was contempt for the Americans, soft, inexperienced, obsessed with material comfort. By 1944, the contempt has been replaced by something closer to awe, tinged with resentment. The Americans are still not considered great warriors in the classical sense. They do not have the tactical brilliance of German panzer commanders or the fanatical courage of Japanese infantry, but they have something perhaps more dangerous. They have turned warfare into an industrial process, a matter of production schedules and logistics chains and replacement rates. They approach war the same way they approach manufacturing automobiles, with standardization, efficiency, overwhelming material superiority. A German fighter pilot, captured after being shot down over France, is interrogated by American intelligence officers. He is asked about his training, his aircraft, his tactics. At the end of the interview, he makes an observation that the intelligence officers include in their report. "You do not fight like warriors. You fight like a factory. And we cannot bomb your factory." He is correct. The American industrial base is 3,000 miles away, across an ocean, untouchable. The factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles continue producing tanks, aircraft, trucks, weapons, at rates that Germany cannot match and cannot stop. Every B-17 that burns over Germany is replaced within days by another rolling off the assembly line. Every crew that is lost is replaced by another graduating from training. The arithmetic of attrition, which traditionally favors the defender, is being inverted by industrial capacity that exceeds anything the world has seen. The strategic bombing campaign will continue for 2 more years, evolving as fighter escorts become available, as tactics improve, as the balance of power shifts inexorably toward the Allies. But the psychological impact of those early missions, the missions when American bombers flew through flak and fighters without escorts, relying only on their formations and their firepower, and their sheer stubborn refusal to turn back, that impact is permanent. The German officers who watched those formations, who read the battle reports, who tried to develop tactics to stop them, are forced to confront a reality that their ideology did not prepare them for. The enemy they are facing is not weaker than them. The enemy is different, fights according to different rules, draws on resources and a mindset that German military tradition does not know how to counter. By the spring of 1945, when Germany is collapsing and the war is clearly lost, there will be many explanations offered for the defeat: betrayal, conspiracy, bad luck, overwhelming numbers. But in the private thoughts of the officers who faced the American bombers, there is an understanding that is rarely spoken aloud. They were not defeated by superior tactics or greater courage. They were defeated by a nation that could afford to build bombers strong enough to absorb punishment, train crews well enough to maintain formation under fire, and produce both in such quantities that losses, even catastrophic losses, were merely speed bumps in a campaign that would continue until victory was achieved. The B-17 formations, silver against the winter sky, became a symbol of something the German military had not encountered before. An enemy for whom war was not about glory or territorial expansion or ideological purity, but about industrial capacity and systematic problem-solving. Every mission was a data point. Every loss was analyzed, studied, used to improve tactics and equipment. The Americans brought to warfare the same mindset they brought to mass production, to building highways, to spanning continents with railroads. They treated war as an engineering problem, a logistics problem, a problem of resource allocation and industrial efficiency. And in the end, that mindset proved more powerful than military genius, more powerful than tactical innovation, more powerful than the warrior ethos that Germany prided itself on. Because wars are not won by heroes, not in the industrial age. They are won by factories, by supply lines, by the ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. They are won by nations that can build bombers faster than they can be shot down, train crews faster than they can be killed, and maintain that production until the enemy's will to resist collapses under the sheer weight of material superiority. The final mission of the strategic bombing campaign is flown in April 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe barely exists. The cities of Germany are rubble. The factories that once produced tanks and aircraft are silent, destroyed, or captured. The bomber crews flying these late missions encounter little resistance. There are no more fighter attacks, no more flak barrages. The formations fly unopposed, a victory lap over a defeated enemy. In the debriefing rooms, the crews who have survived their 25 missions and are rotating home talk about what they have seen. They talk about the friends lost, the aircraft that didn't come back, the missions when the flak was so thick you could walk on it. But they also talk about the pride, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their missions mattered, that every bomb they dropped brought the war one day closer to ending. They do not talk like conquering warriors. They talk like men who have completed a difficult job, who are ready to go home, who want nothing more than to forget the cold and the fear and the violence and return to normal life. This is perhaps the final shock for those German officers who survive the war and reflect on what they faced. The Americans did not want to be warriors. They did not glorify combat or seek battle for its own sake. They wanted to finish the job, win the war, and go home. They fought with the grim efficiency of men completing an unpleasant but necessary task. And that mindset, pragmatic, industrial, focused on outcomes rather than glory, proved to be the most dangerous enemy the German military ever faced. In the years after the war, historians will analyze the strategic bombing campaign, debate its effectiveness, calculate the resources expended versus the damage inflicted. They will argue about whether the campaign shortened the war, whether the civilian casualties were justified, whether precision bombing was ever truly precise. These are important questions, worthy of study. But they miss something essential about what the bomber crews represented. Those formations, flying through flak and fighters, were not just delivering bombs, they were delivering a message that American industrial power was limitless, that American resolve could not be broken by casualties, that the democratic system that Germany's leadership had dismissed as weak and decadent could produce warriors as tough and determined as any the world had seen. Not warriors in the traditional sense, not men who gloried in combat or sought death before dishonor, but warriors nonetheless. Men who would climb into aircraft every morning knowing the odds, knowing that a significant percentage of them would not return, and fly anyway because that was the job, that was what was required, that was how the war would be won. The aluminum skin of a B-17, torn by shrapnel and patched with sheet metal, becomes in memory a symbol of something larger. It represents resilience. It represents the capacity of democratic societies to mobilize for total war without losing their essential character, without becoming mirror images of the dictatorships they fight. The German military was, in many ways, more efficient than the American. German soldiers were often better trained, more experienced, more tactically proficient. But efficiency and tactical skill are not enough when the enemy can afford to learn from mistakes, to replace losses, to grind away at you day after day with resources that seem inexhaustible. The German officers who watched those bombers in 1943 expected them to break, expected the formations to scatter, expected the Americans to learn the lesson that daylight bombing was too costly. They were wrong. The Americans learned a different lesson, that if you build your aircraft strong enough, train your crews well enough, and produce both in sufficient quantities, you can do things that military theory says are impossible. You can fly through flak. You can maintain formation under fighter attack. You can sustain losses that would cripple another nation and keep fighting. This is the truth that the bomber formations carried with them across the skies of Europe, a truth more powerful than any bomb they dropped. That free societies, when threatened, can mobilize resources and human courage on a scale that totalitarian regimes, for all their propaganda about strength and will, cannot match. Not because democratic citizens are inherently braver or more willing to sacrifice, but because democratic societies build systems, industrial systems, training systems, logistical systems that can sustain war efforts over years without collapsing, that can absorb losses and learn from mistakes and adapt. The war ends, the bombers come home, the factories convert back to peacetime production, the crews disperse, returning to farms and cities, to families and jobs, to lives interrupted by war and now resumed. In a decade, they will be building suburbs and highways, launching businesses, raising children, doing all the ordinary things that citizens of peaceful nations do. The violence will fade, become memory, become history. But for those who were there, who flew through the flak and felt the aircraft shudder from shell bursts and watched bombers fall and kept formation anyway, there is a knowledge they carry. They know what they are capable of. They know that when it mattered, when the world hung in the balance, they did not break. They flew straight and level through fire and steel, dropped their bombs on target, and brought their aircraft home. They proved that courage is not just about individual acts of heroism, but about collective determination, about systems and training, and a culture that values each individual life enough to build redundancy into aircraft and doctrine. In the end, that is what stunned the German officers, not the tactics or the firepower or even the sheer numbers. What stunned them was the realization that they were facing an enemy who fought not out of ideology or territorial ambition, but out of a simple, democratic determination to finish the job. An enemy who would accept terrible losses, learn from them, and come back the next day with more aircraft, more crews, more bombs, An enemy who turned war into industry and industry into an unstoppable force. The bombers fly in memory still, silver formations against a winter sky, their engines a distant thunder, their presence a promise and a warning, that free people, when united, are capable of extraordinary things. That abundance used in service of justice is more powerful than efficiency in service of tyranny. That sometimes the most terrifying thing an enemy can face is not ferocity or tactical brilliance, but simple, stubborn, mechanical determination to keep fighting until the job is done. This is the legacy written in the aluminum and steel of those bombers, in the missions flown and the crews lost and the targets destroyed. It is a legacy that speaks not in grand proclamations, but in the steady drone of engines, in formations that hold through flak and fire, in men who climbed into aircraft morning after morning, knowing the odds, and flying anyway because that was the job. That was what freedom required. That was how tyranny would be defeated, and it was.